what are your favorite films or stories that best represent like the nightmare of settler colonialism? And it could be like these bad films that we're talking about. And then also like what are some of the like the films or the stories, we talked about Stephen Graham Jones, that are coming out by Native authors and Native creators, that you best think kind of personify Native horror as a genre?
Ooh, what did I just saw a movie that I was like, this gets as close to some of the, what was that? It's a horror movie that came out recently. I went and saw it and I was like, wow, this gets as close to like some of the WBing stories that I've seen, where it's just about like consumption. What was it? I don't know.
What?
I'll answer the question about native horror.
Okay.
I forget what it was. It was
What's the
um
plot?
Was it Antlers?
no. That one was I did not like. Um it wasn't even about, what was it? It's like it was about like it was about some sort of scary consumptive person. It came out like this year. And I was
Hmm.
like, "Oh, that's pretty close." But I can't.
Was it X?
No, X was good though. X was pretty
I
good.
mean, that was kind of about consumption. It was.
Oh, it was okay. That was it. So it was because it was so weird. So like a good one that got really close to like thinking about the self destructiveness of colonialism was actually David Cronenberg's new movie Crimes of the Future.
Hmm.
Where I got it and I was like, whoa, this is getting pretty close to like what Ojibwe stories about like cannibal beings, right, gets at. Because in that movie, the conceit of it is that, pollution, some sort of catastrophic event has changed human beings so that they're like spontaneously growing new organs. And now there are like children being grown, like children growing up with these new organs that can eat plastic. And I'm like, oh, that's he I was like, that gets really close to thinking about like the existential dread of creating a word, like having to cope with the reality of living in a world that you have fundamentally destroyed. And also, the people who grow these spontaneous organs have to have them removed, because the idea is that if they have these new organ systems, are they human anymore? And so I think he was asking like really interesting questions about like, how do you make relations with beings that are like fundamentally different from you in some way, and like an ethical way, which I think a lot of native stories ask those questions too. And then, yeah, like what does it mean to bring about, like, to have to live in the destruction that certain human beings have wrought? So I really like, I mean, credit to Cronenberg. That is also a really weird film too. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but that was one of those where I left where I was like, okay, this is like getting at some of these ideas that I've seen in some of my favorite native horror texts. And then in terms of some of my favorite native horror texts, I have like a pile of I don't know if I can show you all, since we can see it, my giant pile of books that I have. I don't know, so I'll try to be quick, or offer some that recently stood out to me. And one that I recently discovered that I hadn't encountered before, that I want to give props to for a bunch of reasons, is this book called Ghost Singer, from a writer named Anna Lee Walters. And she is Pawnee and Odo. And this book actually came out in 1988. So it's before NAGPRA was passed. And it's basically this story, and it's kind of interesting too, because she's Pawnee, but she's writing about Navajo characters. And basically this Navajo guy is working at the Smithsonian, and there's this like because the Smithsonian has so many people and so much patrimony, it's just like haunted by these horrific beings that are causing all of the white people working there to commit suicide. And it's actually starting to harm this Navajo guy that's working there too. And so his community kind of comes together and tries to have a ceremony to kind of help what's going on, but like the ceremony ultimately fails. And to me, it's a really interesting novel because it's a novel about like NAGPRA and repatriation that comes out that predates, right, like 1992, the actual laws. So I'm when I teach a class on horror and indigeneity, and I think I'm going to try to teach that one the next time I do it because it's timely, and I think it's a way to show, right, that these conversations were being thought about even before laws were passed.
You know, that's like really fascinating because it makes me think about how they invented songs and ceremonies for people who were drafted into the military or went to World War I because they actually didn't quite, like Lakotas, for example. I know this from my research, didn't know like how to like bring back a spirit in fighting in a foreign country because we never fought outside of our territory. And so they had to make up a ceremony. And from what I understand, because there was never just this massive theft of graves and ancestral remains, that there also, it is not like they were inventing ceremonies, but they had to create like spiritual kind of protection and ways to like communicate with these ancestors because of the genocide and the theft of people that took place. So that's like, and that was written in 1980. I'm writing a list, by the way. I'm going to read this.
Yeah, it's really, and I mean, it's interesting too, because it's thinking, I'm not Navajo, so I would be really interested to hear what someone had to say about like the representation, because it's one of those, like thinking across, like writing across like tribal difference, which I think is also what sort of makes it a fascinating text. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear, to read. Let's see, another one, Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indians. I love that book. I think it's, again, one of those books that exposes, right, like the horror of colonization, because it's about these four guys who, short summary, it's about these four guys who one year decide to go into the elders only sort of hunting area on their res. They're Blackfeet guys, and they find this herd of elk, and they decide, okay, well, we're going to be the heroes and we're going to kill all these elk, and then we'll get all the meat and we'll be the heroes of the community for feeding the community. But they kill all the elk, they take more than they need, and then ultimately the game warden comes and catches them and they have to dump everything anyways. And one of the elk that they kill is pregnant, and her sort of wrathful ghost comes back 10 years later to take revenge on them. It becomes a sort of slasher narrative. And I think what's terrifying about that book for me is that it is about the ways that settler colonialism and colonial society has made it seem like Indigenous peoples have like two options, right? You can either, suffer or die, right? You can either play the game or you can die. And so he's really careful in showing these flawed men who think that, their only option is to make these really bad choices for their community and for their kin, right? Because the elk are kin to the community, and you have to honor that relationship. But what he also does is sort of twist a lot of the horror conventions. There's a final girl in the narrative, and I won't spoil a bunch of it, but the final girl ends up making a very unusual choice that shows that there's, not just two options, there's like 3 or 4 or 5 options that you can make. And the terror is that, the culture we live in has reduced our imagination such that we can't even think about these options as options. And that's sort of embedded in like the form of the book. It's a really beautiful story. I just also read if we're going transnational, I just read this book, Ghost Bird by Lisa Fuller, who's Woolly Woolly, which is an Aboriginal people from Australia, from what's now called Australia. And it's about these two twin girls, and one of the twins goes missing, and the other twin is sort of going out and figuring out, what happened to her. And one of the really interesting things that Fuller does is that she talks about a very specific cultural being, but she never names what it is. And I think that's if I think about, refusal a lot, like Audra Simpson's notion of refusal. And I think that refusal is really, really interesting in this book. And I want to teach this one too, because I think students that aren't Native are going to be frustrated. You're going to be like, why won't you tell us what it is? And it's a good lesson to be like, well, you don't, just like, in a Native community, not everybody gets access to all the information. It's like, you don't get access to this information. Welcome to the lesson. And it's sort of caught up in this plot about, like stolen objects. And that's why why people are disappearing. There's other Native women sort of tied up in this plot of disappearance. It was a really, really beautiful book. It was that, and then the last one that I'll share too. I have a bunch. I can list off a bunch of authors at the end if that's helpful. Is I read Ramona Emerson's Shudder, and Ramona is Navajo, and it is about a woman who is a crime scene photographer, and she's Navajo. But since she's a little girl, she's been able to see ghosts. And so when she goes to these crime scenes to take pictures, and she's also been able to capture on pictures like ghosts ever since she was little too. And so when she goes to these crime scenes, she encounters the ghosts of the people that were killed or murdered. And the story is her sort of trying to figure out the mystery of this woman who was killed, maybe in an accident, maybe not, and also trying to manage the sort of experiences of being an outsider in community, because all the folks there just think she's a witch, and folks don't all the cops of course don't believe that she can like talk to these ghosts and encounter them. And the ghosts are also sort of deeply harmful to her. Like they hurt her body to have to listen to them and to encounter them. And it's just like a beautiful, beautiful novel. The beginning like goes hard. Ramona Emerson like can write gore like with the rest of them. It like goes hard. But it's a really, really interesting novel and a really interesting take on like the crime genre, which is also up until recently and not a genre that, we can talk about like the dark water stuff, I guess, but not a genre that a lot of Native writers have written in so far. I can think of like a handful of other folks, but this was an interesting sort of like horror gore spin on it.